Hello fellow YouTube friends, followers, fools and flabbergastas, my name is Mason and it's time for another Guild Wars 2 easy and flexible build guide. The goal of this guide is to enable you as much flexibility and low switching costs between PvE game modes on a particular class and elite specialization. This means that whenever possible I will use only one set of gear with slight alterations. In turn, I will usually suggest armor and trinkets that allow for high damage, and the necessary defense/support is accommodated for through traits, food and skill changes only. That usually also means that the build is not necessarily always the best in slot choice, but it will pass a certain DPS threshold under the usual raid buffs and get you through pretty much all open world content on your own if needed. Today's class is the Thief, and the lead specialization is the Daredevil, and we're going to talk about two build variants, the Power Daredevil for open world and a Power DPS version for group content. Before we get into more details, let's start with some pros and cons. The build is highly survivable even in glass cannon gear because it has an insane number of dodges and evades. Also, the build does very good damage, over 30k on the golem, with a very simple rotation. What I also like about Thief is the initiative mechanic. It allows you to flexibly use weapon skills without cooldowns on them. A drawback is that, due to the low health pool, the build is quite squishy and punishes you for mistakes. It does not have a lot of in-combat support capabilities, only on certain encounters. Finally, the initiative mechanic can be more restrictive than helpful if you do it wrong. Alright, let's get into the build and start with weapon and utility choices. Staff is the only viable choice for melee combat and group content. I usually run double pistols on a back bar for a ranged option that is easier to play at the cost of a good chunk of your damage. In terms of skills, let's start with a brief outline of the core mechanics of Thieves in Guild Wars 2. Initiative, stealing and stealth attacks. Most classes in Guild Wars 2 have individual cooldowns on their weapon skills, Thieves do not. You can freely use skills as often as you like, as long as your initiative level allows you to. Initiative can be found above your weapon skills and you regenerate 1 initiative per second. Only weapon skills cost different amounts of initiative, not utilities. The steal skill, the next mechanic, is instant, so you can use it at all times and it teleports you to the target. Upon usage, it grants you a stolen skill that depends on the type of enemy that you face. Those stolen skills are pretty useful since they provide a set of different effects: CC, high damage, stealth, healing, conditions, combo fields, etc. Take a look at the wiki page for stolen skills if you need more detailed info on all of their effects. In raids, the most appealing stolen skill is Detonate Plasma, which grants you and 10 allies around you all boons. It has been nerfed a little over time, but is still quite useful even on a DPS build. You can get it on some bosses, for example the Morsad Overseer, Matthias Gabriel, Keynote of the Twin Largos and Cardinal Adina, or even the ads on the Keep construct. The final core mechanic of the Thief class is stealth attacks. Every weapon has one stealth attack that replaces the auto attack whenever the character is in stealth and can only be used once during stealth. If you use another attack that reveals you during stealth, the opportunity is gone, so remember that. Let's start with weapon skills. The staff auto attack chain is one of the most powerful autos in the game, but most of its damage is concentrated on the last part, punishing strikes. Not only do they apply vulnerability, you also reflect projectiles during the channel, and it is a world finisher for combo fields. This also means, however, that you need to predict windows in which you have time to let this animation finish. Particularly in open world, this isn't always easy. The second skill is Weakening Charge. This skill has a quite high tooltip and, surprise, applies weakness to enemies. Aside from the auto attack, this is the skill you want to use frequently for damage purposes, partially due to the Daredevil trait Weakening Strikes, that grants more damage to weakened foes and less damage taken from them. What is a little annoying about this skill is that it is a movement skill that cannot be animation cancelled by dodging in between, so you are stuck in this animation once you start it. So once again, try to make sure that you have time to use this. Skill number 3 is an evade and more of a defensive skill. It cripples enemies and removes immobilize. I rarely use this skill, it's usually not needed to use initiative for an evade this way. Skill number 4 is a bit more useful because it applies blind and vulnerability, so it makes enemies miss and take more damage from all your attacks. Nonetheless, I usually prefer the auto attack chain for vulnerability because it doesn't cost any initiative. The last weapon skill, Vault, is one of my favorites. It doesn't look like it does that much, but it is a great mobility skill and evade, and it does great damage on impact. Paired with dodges, this skill allows you to avoid most of the incoming damage while dealing great damage yourself. And in open world, keep in mind, you heal for the damage you deal. Let's talk about pistol skills. On pistol, 2 skills are very important. The playstyle with pistols changes a little because you can stay at range, meaning that you can avoid damage more easily and kite around. The first important skill is the dual attack unload. This does nice range damage, grants you 1 stack of might per hit and gives you some of the initiative back when you hit it with 8 bullets. This allows you to pretty much spam this skill as long as you can reliably hit. That isn't always easy though. The second important skill is Headshot, skill number 4. This is a great CC skill that you can use twice in a row for even more CC damage if you need it. Paired with Swipe in the open world build, that instantly breaks most CC bars. Since Staff does not have many great CC options on the weapon line, you can swap to the pistol bar for easier access to CC. Moving on to utilities. My utility bar looks pretty much the same on all encounters, regardless of whether it is a raid encounter or open world roaming. First we got Signet of Malice. This heals you whenever you attack. The value seems fairly small, but Daredevil has access to skills that have a lot of attacks in quick succession. Plus this triggers per target hit, so the more targets you hit, the better. Your auto attacks, Weakening Charge, Fist Flurry and Dagger Storm heal you for a lot of health with this skill active. Especially Dagger Storm is incredible because it keeps healing you by hitting in full AoE in rapid succession and makes you invincible for 3 seconds. In the second spot we got an Assassin's Signet. This one grants power passively and 3 times the power for a quarter of the time when activated. This means that when you average the power out that you get out of this, even with Alacrity you get more from not activating it at all. That is only though if you do not line up skills for a bursty combo, because then it can be worth it. Which is also why it is used in the benchmark, but in the simple rotation that we're going to use that does not concentrate on such burst, it is not really worth actively using. Fist Flurry is the third utility skill and this one is great. It does good damage without costing initiative, applies vulnerability, and it grants you access to a secondary skill, Palm Strike, that also does damage and stuns. It's got it all basically. Finally, after that we have Infiltrator's Signet. If you know in group content that you will not be able to reach the critical chance cap, if you miss warrior banners or spotter for example, put a Signet of Agility here for increased precision. In open world, this is a neat stun break that can save your butt whenever you do get hit. It also allows you to use more weakening charges or other initiative skills, so it enables more DPS and a higher weakness uptime. For the elite, it depends on what you need. Dagger Storm is a no-brainer in open world for the crazy combo with Signet of Malice and Invigorating Precision, but in group content you can go with either Thieves Guild for a little more DPS or Basilisk Venom for a strong CC. Let's get to gear attributes. Everything in this build is Berserker. There's really no need to change to anything else. Additional survivability and support can be reached through traits and food, even though I would advise you to get an additional staff for flexibility on the sigils for open world and group content. In the open world build, we're going to run Strength and Accuracy, which substitutes for Spotter and Warrior banners, and the Power DPS version runs Force and Impact. If you really want more survivability and you can afford a second gear set that is also more forgiving, you can get a Marauder set of gear for much more vitality at the cost of a relatively low amount of damage. It also adds a little more precision to the build, so you might be able to drop the Accuracy sigil depending on the encounter. The rune on the armor is always Scholar. Even though the final bonus of the Scholar rune drops fairly easily in open world, the DPS loss from that is fairly small. Eagle would be a budget alternative, but you will most likely overcap on crit chance in group content that way, so you will invest into Scholar runes at some point anyway. Two other fun alternatives for open world would be Ogre or the Goldmancer runes if you like to have a pet to take aggro from you from time to time. So in summary, I suggest these two variants. Let's move on to specializations, traits and consumables. As always, I'm not going to go through all traits here because many of them are self-explanatory. I place emphasis on the traits that are key to the functionality of the build and or differ across the variants. Before we'll get into the details, I'll mention the main difference between the two builds. As usual, the open world variant is meant to sustain on its own, so it chooses some defensive traits over offensive ones. It provides some necessary buffs on its own as well. To do that, we're going to choose Trickery over Deadly Arts. In either case, we will always use the Critical Strikes and of course the Daredevil specializations. Critical Strikes is a no-brainer. It grants you a lot of extra damage through a ton of critical chance and critical damage, and higher fury uptime. The only thing that differs between the build variants is the Grandmaster trait. The open world variant runs Invigorating Precision. This heals you for a % of the critical damage you deal and even more while you have fury, and is the reason why we're building for as much damage as possible. With this trait, more damage means more healing. In group content where you know you'll be healed, no quarter is the way to go. It grants 250 additional ferocity and is a strong boost to your damage given how much crit chance you have. In both build variants we'll be aiming for 83% crit chance in the hero panel. The reason is that both Keen Observer and Twin Fangs are not displayed on the panel. So whenever your health is full and you can flank the enemy, you will have 17% additional crit chance. If you know you can't flank the boss, for example on Sabir, you can again slot the agility signet to cover that gap. Second, in the power DPS variant we'll be using Deadly Arts. It grants you additional power, increased strike damage per condition on the enemy and a fixed 20% increased strike damage versus foes at less than 50% health. It's basically an execute amplifier. So in essence, it is just a significant damage increase but less important than critical strikes. Keep in mind that the damage gain from exposed weakness scales with the amount of conditions on the target. So ideally you'd have as many as possible in the group to make this powerful. Realistically though, only about 10 are maintained by most groups, so keep that in mind. That is also why it's not really strong in solo, since you do not apply a lot of condis on a power build. That is also why we're substituting it with Trickery in open world. Trickery, or at least the traits we're selecting, focuses on empowering Swipe or Steal. With the traits shown here, it makes Swipe have a 17-second cooldown, daze the target, grant Might, Fury, Swiftness and Vigor to yourself and allies around you. It also steals boons from the enemy and grants it to allies around you, and restores 2 initiative and 1 of bar of endurance. So it becomes a very loaded skill that does pretty much everything at once. Aside from empowering Swipe, Trickery raises the maximum initiative and grants 1% damage for every point of initiative you spend for a short time. This is by far my favorite specialization for open world. Finally, Daredevil is required, of course. Daredevil increases your endurance by 50 and adds another bar to it, so you can dodge more often. On top of that, you gain access to physical skills, but we're only using one of them, Fist Flurry, as I've shown before. Most of the traits somehow relate to endurance management and or increasing strike damage. The Grandmaster traits all adjust the dodge mechanic, but more on that in a second. For the Adept trait level, it depends on your preference. Without Marauder's Resilience, you are really squishy. It has around 2k vitality and 10% less damage taken from close foes, which is why I mostly take that in open world. In group content, however, you can go with Brawler's Tenacity for higher DPS from Fist Flurry. The Master trait is set in stone, pick Staff Master. The Daredevil benchmark usually goes with Havoc Specialist, but that complicates the rotation because you need to coordinate your endurance bar and a lot more movement. I usually found that to work fine on a Golem, but in a raid it drastically complicates the rotation, which usually led to lower DPS overall compared to Staff Master. Staff Master also gives endurance back for using initiative, meaning that you'll be allowed to dodge more often. It also grants a flat 240 power while using a staff, so it adds flat damage as well. The Grandmaster traits is also pretty easy to pick since only one of them increases strike damage, Bounding Dodger. This makes your dodges deal damage on impact, and they also grant you increased strike damage for 4 seconds after you land. It takes a little time to get used to, but in actual content, Daredevil is a ton of fun to play this way. In terms of consumables, you only need 3. The Bowl of Orient Truffle and Meat Stew for more might and dodges in open world, power and precision food for DPS, and the Ogre Sharpening Stone for the highest damage gain on the utility item. Last but not least, I provide a brief overview over the rotation that I typically use and skill prioritization. The rotation here is very simple and forgiving. In open world it is hard to give specific advice, you will have to adapt depending on the encounter. For defense, I usually use Vault and dodges. In general though, the more offensive you play the better, since you heal based on damage dealt and per attack. This build is, in group content, great to learn mechanics, since it does not involve a lot of buttons and, given that we're not using Havoc Specialist, allows you to keep your endurance full and use dodges when mechanics require you to. As I mentioned before, there are 3 skills that we're going to be using for damage purposes. Auto attacks, Weakening Charge and Fist Flurry, plus Palm Strike after Fist Flurry of course. Again, you always want to let your auto attack chains finish, and if you can, cast Weakening Charge after every finished auto attack chain. The auto attack animation on Daredevil is quite easy to see, because Punishing Strikes has a much longer animation than the other 2 and a nice and clearly hearable sound. When you see that Fist Flurry will become available within the next auto attack chain, use that instead of Weakening Charge. This way, with Infiltrator's Signet, you should not run out of endurance over time. Swipe should be used on cooldown, even though it does not provide a lot of damage in the DPS variant. Thief's Guild should also be used whenever available. Unless you need CC, then you'd save Basilisk Venom for CC burst phases. Yeah, that's it. The rotation is really simple and, as I said before, allows you to learn mechanics while not feeling like a burden on the group and dealing decent damage. So, the deed is done for now. I hope this was insightful for you and made you want to try Daredevil. Feel free to like and subscribe for the YouTube algorithm, and happy stealing!